Anybody hear from Tony?
Okay, we are recording. No, I didn't hear from Tony. He said he was going to be here, and he may show up. We still don't have Bill yet either, William. So hopefully we'll have him soon. But ease time. We need to get started. So before we dive into the text, was there anything that anyone wanted to bring up from last week? Anything you've been processing? Anything that's on your mind? I keep expecting Allison to say something. He's looking very pensive over there, dear.
I do. Actually, it was today, for some reason, this kept popping in my mind, how we were talking about the suffering and kind of how the Catholic point of view, or like at this point in time, the point of view is you had to suffer in order to, I don't know, that was just the whole thing, and we were talking about it. So I was thinking about it today and processing out of nowhere, and then I was relating it to like growth for some reason. I kept saying, well, I think it's kind of essential to feel certain pains and experience a certain pain in order to grow and learn new things. And so I was kind of toying with that suffering and in my mind throughout the day, actually today. Not that we have to go into it, but it was just a thought that kind of came up and was percolating in the mind.
Well, and it's true. We do grow through the suffering. And that was one of Richard Rohr's main themes in Falling Upward, that he was talking about necessary suffering. He was talking about that's how we actually do progress, is through, he said, the way that we progress is through either great love or great suffering. And actually, it's a combination of the two. And so, yes, it is by suffering. Now, unlike, the Catholic beliefs of the time of Brother Lawrence and medieval beliefs, we don't believe that we need to go out and make ourselves suffer in order to grow. But we're certainly, as we just keep breathing in life, we're going to experience our share of difficulties and grief and sorrow and trauma and all of that. So life is going to serve it up. We don't need to go find it. But when we do, if we can ask ourselves, instead of, why me, it's more, what does this have to teach? Or what can I learn from this? And then move through it. Stay present even to the painful moments so that we can find God in the midst, who is our escape, as 1 Corinthians 10:13 puts it. So yeah, it's a necessary part of life, and suffering is what we grow through, but we don't have to go looking for it. It will come to us. And so that's a little bit different. And we're going to be hitting a lot of that in the second conversation. So that's going to be a major theme in the second conversation, as you will see. So more to come on that, Allison. Hello, William. William's here. Randy's here. Anybody else? Yeah.
Where's Frankified?
All right. I think we got our quorum now. So let's go to page 24. I wanted to back up just a few paragraphs to give us a running start. We're not going to read the whole thing, but I kind of wanted to summarize some of the points that Brother Lawrence has been making, of course, through his, would you call him a biographer? Anyway, Joseph de Beaufort, and who is the one who is writing his recollection of these conversations with Brother Lawrence. This first one, August 3rd, 1666. And so he is remembering the conversation, made these notes, and then wrote up these transcripts, sort of transcripts. But right at the top, on page 24, he's talking about Brother Lawrence and what he expected when he had come into the abbey, come into the monastery. And he says that he had desired to become a religious, thinking that by doing so, he would be censured for his clumsiness and faults, and so would sacrifice his life and all his pleasures to God, but that God had deceived him or outwitted him and gave him nothing but pleasure. I love that. So in the usual Catholic idea, he's this clumsy lummox. He's not worthy of anything. He's the worst sinner he knows. I knew several people who used to say that. He's the worst sinner he knows. And for the first 4 years was sure that he was going to be going to hell, that he was damned. And so he's expecting to get all of these, what the Catholics at the time, Christians at the time used to say, mortifications of the flesh. And yet all he got was pleasure. So God deceived him in that. And that's going to be a theme that you're going to see through Brother Lawrence too, where he's always expecting or feeling that he should be going through these mortifications, and yet he is getting nothing from God but pleasure and a sense of security and connection, which I think is really instructive for us. Then he goes through these list of things that he thinks that we need to do. Next paragraph, that we should establish ourselves in the presence of God by continually talking to him, that it was shameful to allow thoughts of trivial things to break into the conversation. So he's talking obviously about mindfulness. He talks later about the only thought in your head should be on the task at hand, on the thing that you're actually doing, and everything else should be gone. And then even at a point, you don't even have to be thinking about that. But this idea of establishing ourselves by continual talking. And then we were talking about, well, even after a while, there is no talking, there's no more words. That just becomes ingrained into a seamless sense of presence. Then he says that we should feed our souls on lofty thoughts of God, and so find great joy in being with him. And we talked about these are not lofty thoughts in the sense of theological thought, because Thomas Merton said that the loftier the thought, the loftier, the greater the folly that comes from that supposed lofty theological thought. But if it's just this sense again of presence more than intellectual thinking, then I think we're catching more of the drift that Brother Lawrence is trying to get across to us. That we should enliven our faith, that it was a pitiable thing that we had so little faith. And next paragraph, that we should surrender ourselves in things both temporal and in things spiritual, entirely and with complete abandonment to God. And next paragraph, that he was not shocked at the misery and sin he heard about every day, but on the contrary, considering the malice of which the sinner is capable, he was surprised there was not more of it. So now we're talking about managing our expectations. In all of those kind of exhortations that you see there, we talked about them last week. Was there anything that you wanted to talk about before we move on? Anything not clear? Anything that seems like a hitch? Okay. So actually, this last paragraph is where we left off. So he's not shocked at the misery and sin he heard about every day, but on the contrary, considering the malice of which the sinner is capable, he was surprised there was not more of it. He prayed for the sinner, but knowing God could right the matter whenever he wished, he did not allow himself to be too upset. I love this kind of managing of attitudes, managing of expectations that seems to be going on here in Brother Lawrence. He is going to continually set a default for himself and basically for humanity around him of defaulting to the imperfect, defaulting to the flawed, defaulting to brokenness, defaulting to sin, you know, as he would call it. And so he's not excited or upset when either he fails himself or when he sees the failures around him, because he expects that. But he still knows that God could right it at any moment. So he's talking about this unoffendability that we make such a deal of, and the Desert Fathers did as well. So to become unoffendable, basically, again, Jesus from the cross, forgive them, Father, they don't know what they're doing. That kind of idea seems to be in the context here, what he's talking about. And also, even though he says, when considering the malice of which the sinner is capable, no, that's not what anyway. The sin he heard about every day, the misery and sin he heard about every day. But I'm wondering if also this would also pertain to a personal affront. You know, if someone did something to him that hurt, was, you know, in any way offensive, he would take this same sort of attitude and just chalk it up to, You know, this is what people do. God can fix it at any moment. I'm not going to let it upset me. I'm not going to let it stick with me. I'm not going to let it build a resentment. You know? So I'm extrapolating from this, but it seems like a very healthy way to live. Dealing with all the slings and arrows that we are heir to quote my Shakespeare. Good enough?
Being unoffendable,
Yeah,
like
go
you
ahead.
say, right? Being unoffendable, like you say, Dave, right?
It is a key concept and one that we have really lost. We've made a virtue out of being offendable these days. Everything is about offense and writing offenses and speaking our truth and all of these sorts of things. You know, where is the unoffendability? You know, why can't we give people a little more rope? You know, that's the genius here, I think, of Brother Lawrence. And of course, Jesus and the Desert Fathers.
Yep. And it's kind of, you know, there's certain things that are in God's domain, right? Like he knows everything, so he can judge because he has all the information, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And we never have all the information. All we have is our own perspective ever. That's all we get to have on a good day. You know, and you like whenever we're judging, whenever we're relying on our own understanding, we're committing an error, right? We're just like there's an error built into that naturally. So I just love that idea of, you know, it's not even my place to figure out the rightness and wrongness. You know, it's just let it be. I like the way he said that there.
Mm-hmm. It's so funny. You were just talking about that we always see everything from our perspective. And I flashed on when you're writing a novel, you have to decide on your point of view, right? You have to decide on your perspective. So you can write in first person, or you can write in third person. You can write third person omniscient, you know, or third person limited. You know, have all these points of view that you can write from. But we always live our lives in first person. We're in every scene, right? And we can only see it through our eyes, but we're in every scene and everything is from our point of view. We never really get to see, like a third person novel would let us, especially if it's omniscient, would let us into the minds of all these different characters. And we can cut from scene to scene, and we can have different points of view that are actually guiding us through these different scenes. And in life, it's all first person. And so we're always limited by what we can see, what we can sense, what we can know. And we can't know all this other stuff. So just like William's saying, we don't have the information to know what all is going on. And yet we are so ready to be offended by the little sliver of what we can see in any scene. It's
right.
It's the way we're wired, you know. But it would be great to kind of pull back. And I think that's what contemplative life allows you to do. It allows you to pull back. Yeah, you still don't get to see it from third person omniscient, but you can at least start to let go of the tight grip that you have on your first person point of view. Start to give a little grace to those around you.
I wonder how old he was during this first conversation, because he started when he was an 18-year-old and he saw the tree, and, you know, and during the winter and spring is coming. To come to this point, I wonder how old of a man he was by this first conversation, because when he talks about having this attitude and every moment is with God, I have moments like that, but it's not every moment of my day. And then sometimes I wake up feeling cranky and I feel he's superhuman, and I don't think I can attain that. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe when I'm 99 years old, then I'll have that serenity. But I don't know, it's hard.
Well, first of all, remember there was some question about when he was born, and even the materials here all kind of contradict each other. But the translator here said the most reliable birth year we have is 1614, and this is 1666. That would make him 52.
Well, plus, didn't he go through like a atrocious war before that also? I mean, so he
Mhm.
had seen some things, it seems like, and
Yeah, he was
he's
fighting in
already,
the 30 Years' War.
yeah,
And it was a particularly brutal war with lots of atrocities, and he probably witnessed some of those. So, that grows you up faster. And and then being in the monastery, which was very austere, of course, in terms of their lifestyle. And so there were some things that would grow him up a heck of a lot faster than we do certainly here in Orange County.
But I was wondering too, most soldiers coming back from war, you get PTSD. He gets serenity.
No, he didn't. Remember
No,
that.
he didn't.
No. In fact, it was his PTSD, and it was the confusion that he was in that first pointed him in the direction of taking on a religious life to expiate his sins and do this and do that. And for the first 4 years, we're going to hear just in a minute here, he was convinced that he was damned. He was convinced he was going to hell. And then it was 10 years that he really struggled, just trying to find his footing and trying to find where he was. So it wasn't until a full 10 years later that he started to experience some of what we're talking about here. So it wasn't an easy transition for him. It was very difficult at the beginning, but by pushing through it and giving himself over to the trust of God, that's when things started to click for him. So it wasn't all sweetness and light, Ellen, by any means. And I'm sure he woke up cranky too. And that's the thing that we've got to remember. He's not superhuman. He's just a guy, but he pushed through. And maybe he also just had the right combination of personality and whatnot that allowed him to do this. But I think it was just a dogged perseverance and a showing up day after day that got him to this place. And he does say that not everybody can attain to the same level, as anybody else, but everyone can be improved in terms of their ability to just accept life on life's terms and live with hope and gratitude. Same thing we're talking about here, by following this practice of presence. But yeah, please don't assume that he just switched it on like a light bulb and it was smooth sailing, because no, it wasn't like that at all.
No.
Okay, let's continue. Bottom of page 24, that in order to become abandoned to God in the manner he wishes us to, we must watch carefully our impulses which affect our spiritual life as well as our mundane activities, that God would give light in this matter to those who truly desire to be united to him. That if he's talking, this is Joseph Beaufort talking now, if I had this desire, I could come to him, Brother Lawrence, whenever I wished, without fear of bothering him. But if not, I should not come to him. That's a pretty cool little qualification he does there, don't you think? Hey, if you really have this desire, if you really want this presence, then come to me as often as you want, and I will never, ever be bothered or be tired of you coming. But if you're not ready, don't bother coming at all. I remember the first AA meeting that I was invited to come to, and because I wasn't in the program, but I was invited as a guest. And the first one I went to, this old timer stands up to do a share, and he talks about that. Yeah, there was this time this newcomer came into a meeting. I took one look at him, realized he wasn't ready, so I walked over to him, gave him a $10 bill, and said, "Go have a couple of drinks. Come back when you're ready."
Oh.
And my jaw just fell on my chest, because like, how in the world could you do that? Give money to an alcoholic and tell him to go have a couple of drinks? Now I get it. I understand. He was going to have those drinks anyway. It really didn't matter. But why waste the time of the people in the meeting if he wasn't ready to really be serious about taking it on and understanding what it was all about? In a sense, this is what Brother Lawrence is doing to Joseph. You know, he's saying, hey, if you're ready, I'm here for you, no matter what. But if you're not, go have a couple of drinks and come back when you're ready. So he's screening out the unserious. He's screening out those who are not ready, because you have to be ready. You know, we're always talking about when the teacher is ready, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. Same kind of idea here, you know. Brother Lawrence is there as teacher if you're ready. But if you're not, then no matter what he does or says, it's not going to make any difference anyway. So that's a basic issue here. And he says before that God would give light in this matter to those who truly desire to be united to him. So that's the idea when the student is ready. But it also all makes it sound as though God is choosing who's ready and who's not. And I just want to let you know that every time that there is, it's kind of an idiomatic way of speaking. The Hebrews do it, and these certainly these Christians do it. In terms of looking at God from a sovereign point of view, that God is sovereign, he is the only actor that matters in all of creation. And so when they put it in that way, it sounds like God is choosing. Many are called, but few are chosen. We have that same sort of idiomatic way of speaking, when the truth of the matter is everyone is called, few choose to be chosen, is the way that we should read that, because really we're the actor here. God has already chosen everyone. God has already poured out everything that everyone could possibly desire. It's a question of whether we will choose that back, whether we will do whatever it takes to be availed of those gifts. That's the real question here. And so whenever it sounds as though God is picking and choosing, just remember, he's absolutely equal opportunity employer. Okay? You can ask Kathy about what that means from HR perspective. It's equal opportunity. Nobody gets second shrift. Nobody is left out. Nobody is not chosen ever. And we have to remember that. But that doesn't mean that everybody is going to be in God's presence, because it's up to us. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Brother Lawrence spent a good decade banging his head against the kitchen wall, you know, trying to figure this thing out. And he finally did. And that's why we're reading about him, you know. But that's our choice, not God's choice. The beginning of that paragraph is also interesting to me, that in order to become abandoned to God in the manner he wishes us to, we must watch carefully our impulses, which affect our spiritual life, as well as our mundane activities. So he's talking about building awareness here. He's talking about really spending, you know, some conscious, intentional effort all day long and watching where it is that we are taking our consciousness as we go through our daily activities of living. Because if we're not aware of those, then we don't see how we're present, how we're not. And the illustration I like to use here, and some of you have already heard it, but for some of you, my jokes will be new again, is that I studied lucid dreaming at a point in my life decades ago. And lucid dreaming is a dream that you wake up inside of the dream, you realize you're dreaming, but you don't wake up out of your sleep. So now you're awake inside the dream. And once you are consciously awake inside the dream, you can take that dream anywhere you want to go. It's really wild to wake up inside your dreams and then be able to make choices within the dream and do whatever you want to do. It's a bizarre experience. But in order to get to the point that you can wake up inside your dream, you have to question your consciousness all day long. So all day long, you're asking yourself, am I asleep or am I dreaming? And then you're looking for cues and clues that may tell you that you're dreaming. You know, if perspective is off, if colors are off, if you're having this conversation, but you're in the home that you grew up in as a child, you know, and as soon as you start to see those discrepancies, you're like, oh, it looks like I might be dreaming. And then there are things you can do. You can look at your hands. Something about looking at your hands will wake you up, or you try to read something because you can't read in a dream. Anyway, there's all these different things that you can do to wake yourself up inside the dream. But the key is during your waking day, you're always asking the question about your consciousness. Am I awake or am I dreaming? This is not unlike the way that we actually start to build our awareness during the day. Where are my thoughts right now? Are my thoughts really on what I'm doing, or are they scattered all over the place? And what's the content of those thoughts? Is it negative and it's dragging me down? Is it positive? What's going on? But to get into the habit of constantly asking yourself and bringing yourself back to consciousness, I really think that's one of the blessings of the multiple prayer times that the ancients had, you know, and the Muslims still do, where a blast comes out and a call to prayer comes out at given times during the day, where it's really kind of a call back to consciousness, a call back to presence, you know, a call to bring God back into the daily activities of living at points during the day. And what Brother Lawrence is doing is making that a continuous stream of seeing where his presence is, where his attention is, where his thoughts are. And I think that's a key. If we're really going to practice this, we have to become aware during our day until the presence starts saying us, right? In other words, we're saying that prayer, we're coming back to presence over and over until it's just ingrained in us and it becomes our default position. Making sense? A little bit?
Yes.
Any thoughts about, oh, I got the thumbs up from Allison. Okay, I'm doing all right. She came online just to give the thumbs up. That's great. Any thoughts about any of that? Because that concludes the first conversation. All right. I was honoring the silence, which just reminded me Danielle's not here. Yeah. She's the one who told me to honor the silence. Let it be silent for a moment. Okay, so we're going from now August 3rd to September 28th. So just we got a couple of months later, also in 1666, Joseph de Beaufort has a second conversation with Brother Lawrence. And it starts out like this on page, oh, there's no page number, right? 27. That he, Brother Lawrence, was always governed by love, with no other interest, and without concerning himself as to whether he would be damned or saved. Now that's interesting, right? That Brother Lawrence was always governed by love, with no other interest, and without concerning himself as to whether he would be damned or saved. But having resolved to make the love of God the end of all his actions, he found this decision most satisfactory. That he was gratified when he would pick up a straw from the ground for the love of God, seeking him alone and nothing else, not even his gifts. Let that last line sink in for just a second, and then tell me what you think he's talking about. What does it mean that he was gratified when he could pick up a straw from the ground for the love of God, seeking him alone and nothing else, not even God's gifts? What's the distinction he's trying to make here?
Of anything in return,
I'm sorry, John, what was that?
that he was giving without any expectation of anything in return.
Okay. How do we separate God from his gifts? What does that mean to separate God from his gifts?
I think it's also what we do sometimes, many times what we do is saying, well, then I'll be rewarded in heaven. If I do this, then I will get salvation. What I take from it is that it just is. Whether, like Mr. John said, there's no expectations. I pick up this straw. That is it. This is the love of God. That's it. There's no other attachments to it.
That's also good. So are God's gifts about heaven in the next life? Is that the reward? Or is there any other way that we can look at God's gifts?
I don't want to wait for it at the end of my life. I would like it to be here now, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Scotty?
God's gifts are available now, in the future, and They have been available in the past. God's always been and always going to be. And
So
he
what
is
are
the
those gifts that you speak of which you
love,
speak?
life, creation, everything contained in creation. They're all gifts. It's our playground if we want it. He says
Okay.
he leaves very little. The Bible seems complicated, but if you read it enough, there's a kind of a driving home point, sentence after sentence. And if we operate in love and forgiveness, if we can get those two things down and let them guide and direct our life, it opens up a lot of doors, I'll tell you.
Mm.
Okay, so we have gifts that are in the next life, gifts that are in this life, and that Brother Lawrence is doing all he does without any thought of a return, a reward.
Mm.
But I think there's one more way to look at God's gifts that I think are going to be really important. And I have the advantage of having read ahead, so I think I know where he's going. And so that's one of these things. But he's going to make a big issue about emotional rewards and feelings, ecstasies, the opposite of mortifications, what the early church used to call consolations. You know, kind of that honeymoon period that you have, that new converts often have, the pink cloud that we talk about in the program. You know, it's that kind of thing that God, remember he said that he expected God to really be chastising him in the religious life because he was such a wretched person and a clumsy lummox and all of that. And all he got from God was pleasure. Well, that pleasure, that felt response that he had to God's presence, he considers God's gifts. But he's not even looking for that. He's seeking God for God alone and nothing else, not even the gifts, not even those consolations, not even those feelings of pleasure. Now, part of that is going to be his Catholic viewpoint, right? Because you approach Christ through suffering, not through pleasure. But he can't seem to get to the suffering. He keeps finding the pleasure. Now, again, Ellen, this is after a good decade of fighting through this stuff. But I think it's important that every action that he does, picking a straw up off the ground, is focused on God and God alone, the presence of God for its own sake, and not for any other outcome or any other reaction down the road. And this is a big distinction that he's going to keep making.
Intimate
let's read-
relationship.
Go ahead, Scott. What's that?
An intimate relationship.
The intimate relationship, and not the way it made him feel,
Right.
and not for anything else that might have been any kind of reward following that.
That's good.
So let's read a little bit more and see if it gets, because he's going to develop this, that this behavior of his soul caused God to grant him endless graces, but that in taking the fruit of these graces, that is to say, the love that arose from them, he had to reject their appeal, knowing that was not God. The appeal of these graces was not God, since he knew by his faith that God was infinitely greater than this and than whatever else he felt. By doing this, a marvelous struggle between God and the soul took place. God giving and the soul denying God giving and the soul denying that what it was receiving was God. All right, that's a little bit difficult to parse. God is giving and the soul is denying that what it was receiving was God, because this felt response is not God. Right? Now listen to this next sentence. This is going to really bake your noodle. That in this battle, the soul, because of its faith, was as strong or stronger than God, since God could never give so much that the soul could not deny that what he gave was himself. Ooh, yeah.
That's going to take some
Thank
deep
you, Kathy,
thinking.
because
Yeah, sorry.
that's
I'm
what
lost.
you gotta read. But this is, see, he has a way of using some of these striking phrases. The soul, by its faith, is stronger than God. I wanted to say stronger than dirt, but that would have been bad. Stronger than God, since God could never give so much that the soul could not deny that what God gave was himself. What in the world is he saying there? Does that make any sense to anybody yet.
No.
I think my TV dinner is ready. I gotta go.
I think the piece that's confusing to me is in the sentence before, he's talking about the soul denying,
Mm-hmm.
but then goes into the soul because of its faith. Well, it's faith of what? If it's denying, was it stronger than God? It's faith in denial. I don't quite.
Okay, and that's the difficulty here. Do you remember me telling you the story? And this comes from the Desert Fathers. There was a young monk who, a novice, who was part of the abbey, and he was so on fire for God. He was so excited and just completely sold out that he would literally levitate while they were praying in the chapel. And then after this was going on for several weeks, the abbot, the elder, finally said, "You get down, rejoin your brothers, grow up, and move on." You know. Now, see, we would think that, man, if you could levitate, that has to be the highest point of spiritual advancement and whatnot. To them, it was a sign of immaturity. It was a sign that you were still in this beginning phase of your consolations. It's when you came back down to ground. It's when that you were dealing with the daily activities of living and all the mundane things we go through without a felt response. Was your faith strong enough then to be able to continue to persevere, to do the things that you knew to do, to keep showing up if you weren't still getting these pleasures, these consolations, these rewards? And this is what he's talking about. This idea of a mature faith, which is a faith that is not felt anymore. It doesn't have, we've gone from the consolations now to the desolations. John of the Cross, we talked about him last time as well, talks about this as the dark night of the soul, which is a time when a lot of these trappings of faith are removed. It's like the safety net gets pulled. And can you still continue on at that point? The soul is not denying God here. What he's talking about, the soul is denying that these pleasures, these emotions, these consolations or gifts are God. That God still stands behind those. This is our reaction to God's presence, but it's not the presence itself. And if we don't make that distinction, then we can end up like a junkie with a drug, right? Because we can be chasing the emotional response rather than just allowing ourselves to rest in God's presence, whatever that may bring. Sometimes it brings an emotional response, and that's a beautiful thing, but sometimes it doesn't. It doesn't mean that was a failure. It doesn't mean that was a time that was not an authentic spiritual encounter. We just keep showing up. And if we're just picking a straw up off the ground, or whatever, we are turning the cake that's frying in the pan, or doing whatever it is we do during the day, we don't need to question whether God is there or not, because we're having or not having an emotional response. And so trying to parse that out is what he's talking about, separate those in his mind so that he's not just chasing a good feeling. He's not just chasing that temporal reward, but he's still really going right to the center of God's presence. Is any of that making it clear? Go ahead, Becky.
I think the piece that's hard for me to grasp is if I'm in a moment, call it a moment, where I feel God and the connection to God, that connection alone is always going to have some kind of a feeling. In the same way when we connect to anyone, even here, like I don't know how there can't be some kind of a feeling if we're truly conscious of God's presence. Not that it has to be a big exaltation or anything, but a sense of not being alone, a sense of connection. To me, that's a feeling.
And this is something Brady was actually talking about yesterday. Those of you who were here yesterday, you remember where he was talking about during his near-death experience, or he would say death experience, he was made to know things but it wasn't an emotion. He was trying to get down to, there was a difference between an emotion and a feeling, and this awareness that he was made to know, and that there was a presence behind that being made to know. But it was separate from a feeling or an emotion. He was making a distinction that really couldn't be articulated any better than I just tried to. But there was a difference for him between a feeling or emotion and an awareness of this connection or this presence. And I think that's what Brother Lawrence is trying to get at here.
Right.
Now, I can tell you that, I'm a little bit aspy, I believe, because that's, I check all the boxes, at least, especially when I was a kid. And so, I don't tend to emote as much, like Marian, she's so intuitive, everything flows to her as feelings. They don't necessarily for me. And so I always thought there was something wrong with me because I wasn't feeling what other people would express they were feeling in their prayers or in their worship or, God speaking to them or whatever it was that they were expressing. And I remember, and I think I've said this before, that Thomas Keating really saved me there because he was talking about the same thing, that that there is a difference between an emotional response and a spiritual encounter. Sometimes they coincide and it's great, but they don't always. And some of the most mature people he knew that have been practicing contemplative, contemplative, practice for decades, thought there was something wrong with them because they didn't have these great emotional responses that others seemed to. And he said, yet they were the most mature, spiritual people that he knew. And so what it did for me was allow me to relax and start to say, okay, there's nothing wrong with me. Sometimes I have the feelings, sometimes I don't. But as long as I keep showing up, I have the spiritual encounter. And there is an awareness of connection, but it doesn't necessarily translate to an emotion for me. And so that's why a paragraph like this is so important. And it may be of varying importance to the rest of you, but I think it is an important thing to at least consider, because what if there is a situation that really is difficult? It's either painful, traumatic, it's a loss, it's grief, whatever it happens to be. And we want to assume that God is not present in that because we don't feel the connection. All we feel is the pain or the disconnection. Right. But if we're willing to lean into that, even there is a connection that is still available. There's still the.
But I think coming back to what Becky's saying there, like even in the midst of a crisis, if you have this felt experience that I'm not alone as I'm going through this crisis, it will have to change your emotional experience in that crisis, right? I mean, is that what you were speaking to, Becky? Like that, I think.
Yep.
You're being held.
Yep.
Right? And just that knowledge that I'm being held does something.
And maybe I'm thinking of gender differences and, we're all created differently. And this could be a gender difference too, that I get what you're saying, Dave, in terms of an awareness. And for some that may stay in the cognitive realm. And for others, it may hit in an emotional place. And my hunch is that there could very well be male, female brains are very different. There could be just a difference in gender.
I think what I'm trying to say is that there's an in-between. It's neither cognitive nor emotional. It's in between.
But if you say you have an awareness, isn't that
there's an awareness? But
cognitive?
no, because I'm not thinking about it. If I'm really in the state of flow, or if I'm in a centering prayer, the thoughts have been displaced. So I'm not thinking about it, but I'm still aware of it. But it also may or may not give me an emotional response. And if it did give me an emotional response, if I was in centering prayer, that's another thing that I would let dissipate, because that's not the place for it. In centering prayer, the place is to just be present. And so emotional affect or sensory input or thoughts are all, when I say the sacred word, that's what I want to displace and come back to that stillness. And so there's an in between also, because that's the best I can sort of do. You know, I think though, if this isn't important to you, then never mind, you know, put it on the shelf. You know, for me, it was so important for me to even be able to continue on, because I kept banging against that place where I thought that I was supposed to feel something in order to have an emotional encounter. And what Lawrence and Keating are telling me is, no, you don't need to. It's great when you do, but you don't need to. And what Lawrence is actually saying is that he had to make that distinction so that he made sure he wasn't just going after the good feeling. He was actually desiring God's presence for it alone. Go ahead, Bill.
Dave, I was, you know, I don't, so much of the time, probably all the time, I feel like I'm pretending he's present. And without a sense of emotional settledness within myself, not that I'm seeking that, but without that as kind of an indicator that I'm somehow connecting to God, you know, I'm finding myself really feeling like I'm pretending almost 99.9% of the time.
So what are you saying, that you feel you're pretending because you don't feel a stillness at the core, or is that what?
Well, no, I can feel a stillness, but what this is kind of talking about is that it's not that I'm seeking that stillness, but my only indicator that I'm having any kind of perceived connection with God is that I feel settled amidst whatever else is going on. It's not that I'm seeking it, but my sense of God's presence in my life is, other than cognitive, telling myself I know he's around, and times when I say I don't know that he's around because I don't, it's so silent. Without that sense of emotional connection, I feel like I could be just, you know, praying to the doorknob. So there's something about that emotional, to me, I would put feeling settled inside, not that I've concluded or thought something through now that I know there's some certainty to it, but that there's a sense of settledness within myself amidst whatever is going on and going on around me, even though I'm aware of there's that settling. And that's my only connection with my interpretation of how I'm connecting to God.
Are you considering that settledness an emotion? Is that a feeling?
That would be more where I would put it, because prior to that quieting, I can feel my emotions drift. I woke up this morning feeling peaceful, and as the day went on, for no particular reason, I started feeling unsettled. And so every time I'd quiet, I was aware that my emotions were still reeling a little bit, even though I couldn't put my finger on why. But to me, when I can purge all that stuff out of my head and my emotional barometer just kind of settles into a stable place, then I feel like I'm connecting to God at that point.
Could it be that the feeling of settledness is actually the absence of a negative affect or emotion?
Of course, yeah. It could be the absence of whatever it is that's stirring up my angst or nervous or worried. You know, we're engaging more with our adult kids, and, you know, that always seems to subconsciously start to reel things. But and this one over here.
What do you mean?
That's when we go to Couples Anonymous.
So maybe what we're talking about is kind of that neutral position in between, you know? It's not really a positive or a negative feeling. It's not a feeling of agitation, but it's not also either a feeling of exaltation. You know, it's just that kind of, you could put it, Bill, settledness, or maybe just contentment, you know, because I certainly feel that much more. I feel much more settled generally in my life than I did certainly a decade ago. And I can take things that happen with much more unoffendability. You know, I can go through life that way. And so I see that as me becoming more and more aligned with God's presence. But it's not necessarily an emotion. But I think it's up to every one of us to come to grips with this in ourselves. I mean, how do we make that distinction? Is it even important to make that distinction? It was very much important for Brother Lawrence, but then remember, he's also working through that Catholic feeling of mortification of the flesh, right? Where by getting closer to Christ, he has to be feeling some kind of pain and trauma and that sort of thing. So for him, maybe it was more important to realize that the pleasure that he was feeling was not God either, and that he needed to come between that. So maybe that was working against, some of the doctrine of the time. And since we aren't really following that kind of doctrine, that's not our baseline, that we don't have to make such a big deal about this. And that could be too. But I think it is important for us at least to not pin the quality of our social encounters on the emotional content, and not say, oh, because I felt so good that God was really there, and these times God is not, or especially my times of trauma and difficulty or grief or loss, God is not there. We want to make sure that we can still see God equally present in everything that life presents. And so a distinction like that needs to be made, I think. But maybe some of these other things we're talking about, not so much.
Yeah, I found myself thinking about a conversation I had earlier today with a client about this idea that, we're always in this struggle, right? There's always this ideal version of myself that I know I can be and I'm capable of being. And then there's me. And then there's the distance in between, right? And that distance will always look like some form of struggle, right? It will always look like it's the very distance of my personal growth. It's the distance of my struggles, my suffering, all of it is in that space, right? Between who I am and who I want to be. And that is constant all the way up until we die. Right. And the idea that we can make friends with that and be good with that part of myself, as I'm not beating myself up necessarily, but I'm still striving to get better. And there's a little of anxiety in there and suffering and whatever. And all of that is part of the landscape, essentially. So being able to be present to all of it, like any other gift from God, basically, and being able to, and I forgot what Allison was talking about at the beginning, but this idea of suffering being part of the good, because it's that suffering is part of what's guiding us to our better self, essentially.
Yeah, that's good.
And we don't get to our better self without it. We can't. We just can't. There's no need to get to our better selves if the suffering is absent.
Purpose in the pain, right?
Yes, purpose in the pain. Exactly.
Yeah, Dave, I'd like to say something where it says that in this battle, the soul, because of its faith, was as strong or stronger than God, since he could never give so much that it could not deny that what he gave was himself, but what God gave was himself. And I likened it for some reason in my, my simple mind. In a baseball game, there was a man on first base. I'm playing shortstop, and the ball is hit to the second baseman. Without thinking about it, I came to second base. I received the throw, and stepped on the base and threw it to first base to make a little play. Didn't think it, and didn't think I was not thinking about anything. I was simply reacting. I didn't think, well, okay, well, I've got to step on the bag. I've got to slide my foot across the bag and step with my left foot and throw it to first base and not throw it away. I didn't think about any of that stuff. I just made the play. And afterwards, And I don't hear anything in that situation. I don't ever remember hearing anything in that situation. And I played a lot of baseball. And welcome to baseball season for all you baseball fans and New Yorkers out there, William. Anyway, the reward I got afterwards was a godlike reward. I mean, there's a simple elation that you get, not necessarily from the crowd response, but in my particular experience. But the reward that I got from being able to make that play and I recall saying thank you, God, for letting me make that play. Now that's maybe really simple, but that to me is what this whole sentence talks about.
Mm-hmm. And maybe this next paragraph can help us. So let's read it.
Dave,
Yeah.
I could be really off, but I see the difference as allowing rather than seeking for something.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So the idea that she's making is that it's a getting out of the way and allowing God's presence to envelop us rather than trying to find it, grab it by the throat and make it ours. Is that kind of what you're talking about here, Patricia?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And this idea of, I mean, it's such an interesting way to put it, that in this battle, right, God is just pouring out all this goodness, but the soul is still denying that the goodness itself, the felt goodness, is God himself, but that God is somehow deeper than that, and not allowing itself to just skitter across the surface of these good feelings, but is still determined to get to the depths. And that makes the soul stronger than God, because no matter how much goodness and pleasure God throws on the soul, it still is able to say, okay, but that's not the end result of all of this. The pure presence is really what I'm after, for its own sake, and not for any of the rewards that I feel. It's like John making the double play. You know, he was aware of everything he was doing, but he wasn't thinking about it. There was no felt response while he was making the play. Afterwards, he had a felt response, but not during that. And maybe that also helps us to understand that in the presence of God, we're not thinking about it. We maybe not feeling it, but it's there and it's real, and we can reflect on it later. But in the presence itself, it just is, right? And now this next paragraph, that Brother Lawrence's ecstasy and rapture were only those of a soul which played with these gifts, instead of rejecting them and going on to God, that beyond the wonderment, one must not let oneself be carried away, that God was still the master. And I see Becky's response there. But I think if we just see where Brother Lawrence is coming from, that the ecstasy and rapture were those of a soul that was playing with the gifts. We're playing with the gifts, but we're still not getting all the way to the bottom of this presence, which is sort of beyond thought and beyond emotion. Remember, kind of like Brady's death experience, where he said there was no feeling. He was made to know things. He was aware of things, but it wasn't thought, word-based thought, and it wasn't emotion either. It was something in between, something deeper or transcendent or whatever. And I think that's the same thing that Brother Lawrence is talking about, that as long as he's feeling the emotions and feeling the high of the ecstasy of the rapture, he's playing with the gifts, but he's sort of still skittering across the surface, right, and not plumbing the depths, because at the depths, he's going to be beneath those things.
Right.
There's another there beyond these things, and he wanted to make that distinction because he always wanted to go all the way to God.
And I'm thinking
any of this, Becky. yeah, I hear it. Go ahead, William. I'm sorry.
I was thinking that's equally true on the flip side, right? When we're getting caught up in the suffering rather than the gifts, right? Like when we're caught up in that level without going deeper. right? It's like when we're at the surface of things rather than going 6 feet beneath the surface of the ocean to that stillness that's down there.
Yeah. Now I grant you that I may be making a lot more about this than I need to, maybe making it more complicated than it needs to be. For me, this was absolutely essential because of my makeup and the way that I came at this. To make this distinction was the difference kind of between life and death. It was a difference of whether I was going to be able to persist or not, because I kept trying to manufacture emotions that I wasn't feeling because I thought that's what I was supposed to do, you know, rather than just being able, kind of like Patricia said, to allow rather than to seek something and pigeonhole it into a way that I thought it was supposed to be because of the way people expressed their experiences to me. So to get shut of all that and just let it be whatever it was just manna from heaven. It's what I needed. Now maybe for you it doesn't need to be, and you're already there. And if that's the case, then please don't worry about it. But I think it is a concept that's going to be repeated here, and not only in Brother Lawrence, but in all the mystics. You know, John of the Cross is huge on this, and really they all are. You know, there's a sense that we have to get beneath these, both the offenses and the pleasures and the raptures and the ecstasies. There's something deeper than that. And so just
so I
see where
have
it
this
lands with
prayer.
you.
So I have this prayer sometimes. Okay, so when days are good, I'm contented and happy. Oh, I can say, oh yeah, look at that flower. That's God. God's with us. That's easy. It is during, like you said, the dark night of the soul, the desolation in the middle of the night. I have this argument with God, actually. I tell him, you know, they say you're here with me. I do not feel you. They say you're here, so you must be here. I don't know that, but I cannot feel you. That's my conversation with him. I argue with him. So, you know what Bill said? Oh, I feel like I'm pretending. I'm not even there to pretend. I'm even there saying, I don't know that you're here, but they say you are.
Right.
So you must be here. And I just let it go. So you must be. Maybe you can hear me, maybe you cannot. But if in case you do hear me, I'm telling you, I cannot feel you.
You hear him laughing then?
I think that's a connection.
You tell him, Ellen.
I know, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, I tend to be combative, actually.
Who are you telling, Ellen?
What?
Who are you telling?
I'm telling God, I'm combative with him.
The
There
God
you
And I
that
feel
you,
okay,
the God
actually,
that you're not
because-
sure is there? You're telling
Yes.
him about this?
Yes.
You're making a choice.
Can you see
Right?
there's a little conflict going on there?
Right?
I
No,
really-
just in case you can hear me.
Alan, I relate
I
to
get-
that because I have to just make a choice that God does, that he is there, because I don't feel that either.
Yeah,
And it's like I've been told that God is there.
right.
And so I tell myself, well, this makes the most sense than to say he's not there. So I just say, all right, do your work, whatever you got to do. I'm kind of like this lump of clay here. Do
Yeah,
whatever.
you must
If
be
you're
here because
really
they
there,
said
then do
so.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I wake up and I go for a walk or go for a workout and I start feeling better. But in the middle of the night, it's like, I don't, this doesn't feel great at all.
That's
But,
it.
you
I
know,
know.
it's like going for a workout too. I mean, I don't love going for a workout all the time, but I sure feel good afterwards.
But yeah, it's those desolate moments and dark nights of the soul that, yeah.
Well, you're in good company, Ellen. Remember when
Yeah.
Jacob wrestled with God all night?
Absolutely.
It's the wrestling that we need to just keep it up, because you know I know I've said this to y'all before, that your spiritual progress is going to be measured in your recovery time, not how many times you're still triggered by certain things. And so when we see ourselves being able to come back to center more and more, when you wake up cranky and yet by mid-morning you're back in a good place, or Bill doesn't feel anything, he's crying out to God, but he goes for a workout or something, and that settledness returns. To me, that more and more is telling us that change is happening in us, because we're continuing to just show up regardless of what we feel or don't feel. And this presence of God starts to manifest itself in ways that usually others see in us before we see it in ourselves. Or we walk into a situation that used to just crank our chain and it barely registers, and we realize we have changed, that we're becoming more unoffendable, and we didn't even see it happening, but we just kept showing up regardless of what we felt. That's why I think a distinction like Brother Lawrence is making here becomes important, because if we only measure our progress on feeling good, then we're going to miss the perseverance that is necessary to just stay by faith.
And just real quick, Dave, too, on that note, I think we've talked before that maybe not waking up cranky in the middle of the night, Ellen, like you're saying, but if we're in crisis, I don't think we really see the purpose in that pain when we're in crisis. We usually feel it much later. And maybe, like you say, it's in that recovery gap time. How long is it going to take me to come out of that and come around and realize there was some purpose in that pain? Or what did I learn about that? But I'm not going to see it very clearly while it's happening. That's for sure. So,
but even through the crisis, will we stay present to the crisis? Or are we going to run to avoidance? Are we going to go take a hit or a drink? Or are we going to do whatever to avoid? Or will we stay present to it and continue to work through it? Because that's a huge piece of this as well.
yes.
Well, and Dave, I need help in articulating. I'm having a hard time finding the words tonight. To me, the knowing doesn't come with the feeling. And I know that God is always there no matter what I'm feeling. The knowing doesn't have an emotion with it.
I think you articulated that perfectly.
Yeah.
Therefore, I don't need, it doesn't mean that I won't have a feeling, because that's part of the human experience. But the knowing that God is always there helps me through the hard times, no matter what the feeling is. It kind of transcends the feeling.
Yep.
Knowing that you won't always feel that he's there.
Right.
Doesn't
Somehow.
change the fact that he's always there.
Exactly. Thank you for finishing my sentence.
But even with that, we're making a choice to believe that he is there.
Right.
We're telling ourselves that he's there.
Good point, Bill.
Yeah.
Yes, but if it's if I wonder if something is what I call a big T truth, that's true for everyone,
Right.
not what my little belief, what I call the little T truth. If I want to know if something's really true, I look to see if it's true for everyone.
Right.
Just a metaphor like gravity. Gravity's true whether you believe it or recognize it or not. You know, as long as we're here on the earth. If I have a cup and I drop it, it's going to fall to the ground. You know, no matter what I believe or what I think. And that's true for everyone. So I would say that's a big T truth.
So Patricia, how do you translate that into a big T truth, that when God is silent?
It just comes as a knowing. And I did have, like Brady, I did have a death experience, and I call mine a death experience because to me it wasn't near. You know, I died. But that didn't change my perception. It just came as a knowing. Even as a child, I've always known that God is there. And it's nothing I don't think I've done or not done. I don't know. People ask, how do you know? And I say, how do you not know? It just comes as a knowing for me.
What do you think of this idea that God is an emotional decision?
I can't trust my emotions.
Well, and I think that's putting, when spiritual things are ineffable to me. It's like trying to put my death experience into words. there's not a language for it.
Mhm.
I don't, emotions can come because that's part of being human, but God to me is not an emotional experience. It's just a fact.
It's interesting, Patricia, you're talking about gravity. Gravity works whether we want to believe it or not. So eventually we can argue with it for a lifetime, or we get to the point where, okay, we accept the fact that gravity does what gravity does. We stop worrying about it. We don't necessarily have a relationship with it, but we rely on it all the days of our life.
Absolutely. You guys really speak Patties, as my kids would say. They used to call me Pat. So that's Mother, I speak Patties. I'll interpret for her. So I appreciate all of you interpreting what I'm trying to say. So thank you, Scott.
No problem.
There's there's still a practicality to it, even using the gravity as an example, because I can experience that.
Right.
The heart of what I'm bringing up is, how do I know I'm experiencing God?
Right.
And that's what I was going to mention too, that gravity has observable effects,
Right.
regardless of what we believe about it. God's effects are not observable in the same way, but I think they're observable in us. I mean, Bill, I've seen huge changes in you just in the time that we've been banging around together. And there are changes in you as you've continued to persevere in coming back to presence with God. And I think those are the gravitational effects of your relationship with God, regardless of what you feel or don't feel. And we've all felt the imposter syndrome, or as I love Thomas Burton, making contemplative faces at ourselves in a mirror. We've all experienced that, because of our frailty and the way that we just don't know what we don't know. But I think over time we do see the effects, and we see what is happening as we continue to come back to presence with God. And it changes our whole attitude and perspective on every moment of our lives as we start to go through it. It changes things, and they are changing. And I think, to me, that's what's convinced me that even when I don't feel God's presence, that it's still there.
I would agree with that, Dave. What I lean into are the experiences that I've felt. And, Kathy, what you were just talking about, where I felt them the most is during the death process of family members, where there's a strange sense of being just feeling okay. If there's something about that experience, there's no doubt that Spirit is present. And that's where I lean into what my experiences of God is. And that's what has guided me since I was 15 years old at this time of year. That's that's what I have to lean into, and I make a choice to lean into that.
And it is a choice. You're right. It is a choice.
It's the best way to go.
Yeah. Well, what I'm convinced of right now is that we got to stop.
Yeah.
Yeah. We got to let our Caribbean and East Coast peoples go to bed here. So it's getting late. But this is, guys, this is where the rubber hits the road. These are the conversations. Because when you are in your own prayer closet, when you're doing this, when nobody is watching, right? When it's 2:30 in the morning, these are the conversations, hopefully, that will ring back in your ears and allow you to just keep going. Just keep showing up. Don't worry about the rest of it. Don't worry about all the things that we worry about. Stop worrying about worrying. Just show up and be, and see what happens. Because over time, God is faithful. This isn't going to come back void, but we just have to keep showing up. Okay. All right, Scotty.
Lord, thanks so much for this great get together tonight. You know our hearts. You know why we make the calls and get on these Zooms, what we're after, what we're looking for, and what we want to do with what we find. And what we want to find most is a relationship with you. One we believe in, the one we're taught about, one we experience, one unfortunately we doubt sometimes. But Lord, regardless of all of those feelings, the permanency, the evidence of you and all creation, your word says all creation testifies as to my existence.
Mm.
I know I can't build a finger out of scratch, Lord. I have to be provided things. So I give you credit for everything coming into existence and everything that's here. Lord, show us your truth. Reveal yourself to us. Thank you for your love and your desire to be in relationship with us. We praise you and thank you in Jesus' holy name. Amen.
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 Thanks, everybody. See you Sunday, Palm Sunday.
Good night, guys.
Good night.
Hey,
Good night.
Bye.
Safe travels.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Good night.
Love you guys. Take care.
Bye, Gail.
Love you.
Bye, Bill.
Bye,
Bye,
Gail.
Judy.
Phil.
Bye, Ellen.
Bye-bye, guys.
Rose.
Dave, Linda.
And Jordana and Linda. Okay. See you guys over the weekend.
Yep.
Okay.
Bye.
Good night.
When